Hey there, my name is Sinister Suspect and I'm an urban explorer and photographer. I like to wander around in abandoned buildings and shoot photographs of them before these buildings are completely lost or demolished. Now, I get a lot of questions a lot of times about how I shoot my images or how I edit my images. That's a thing that a lot of people seem to want to know. So I decided I wanted to do a YouTube channel about it and just see what you guys think of this entire process. So I work in Lightroom CC, this Lightroom CC version 6.5, which is the latest version, and I shoot on a Canon 550D, and nowadays I also shoot on a Canon 60, which is a full frame, but the photos that we're going to be editing today are shot on my Canon 550D with my Sigma 8-16mm ultra wide angle lens. So let's get started. Now, urban exploring involves going to abandoned buildings, or at least mostly you go to buildings or places that are abandoned that have once been in use by people. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It can also be buildings that are not abandoned, but that's a little bit of a different thing. So right here I got 3 shots that I shot at an abandoned village somewhere in Belgium. So I shoot 3 shots, and that's with a very good reason. If you go to places that are abandoned, you usually have to deal with very difficult light conditions. It's gonna be really dark inside these buildings because there's no light. But outside of the building, so when you look through the windows, you look outside, it's going to be really bright. So the dynamic range of these images is really big, and it's almost impossible to capture that into one single image. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to shoot multiple images and then combine those into one final image, and that's what they call HDR processing. So I'm going to be showing you how I do that. You can do HDR in Lightroom, but I like to do it a little bit different, in a way that gives me a lot more control over the actual brightness and toning of the image. So I've got 3 images. One is going to be my main exposure. When I visited this place, I used to shoot 3 exposures for each image. Nowadays I shoot up to 7 exposures, sometimes even more. It kind of depends on the scene I'm trying to shoot and how big that dynamic range is. But back in those days I used to shoot on 3 exposures. So we have one normal exposure, which is this one. It's a tad dark. I could have exposed a little bit higher, but I wanted to keep those highlights and the windows nice. So this is my normal exposure. This is shot at ISO 100 to keep the noise levels down quite a lot. At 8mm, so that's the widest the widest angle of my lens, and I shot it at f11, so that's an aperture of 11 to really get that, basically make the image sharp from front to back. How higher your aperture is going to be, the smaller the opening of the lens, and you're going to get less light, but you're also going to get a much sharper image. Basically the area of the image that's sharp will increase and will be much wider. So when I would have shot this at f3 or something like that, or maybe f4.5, which is the lowest my lens can go, I probably would have had unsharp parts in the image, and right now it's going to be sharp all the way through. It shot at an exposure of 0.4 seconds. Then I have an underexposed image, which is the same settings but shot at 1/10 of a second for the exposure, and then I've done the same thing, but then I overexposed and I created one that was shot at 1.6 seconds. So those 3 images will basically give me the full dynamic range of this image. So how are we going to process this? Well, before I combine these images, I like to do a few things to them. I'm going to go to the develop module, which is down here, and now we can see the first image. So you can see it's a little bit dark, but I exposed for these highlights. I wanted to get detail in that door right there, and some detail in the highlights right here. It's still overexposed, but that's why we have the underexposed one, which gives us a little bit more detail there, and gives us more detail as well here. But here all the shadow areas are completely black, and therefore we have the overexposed image, which gives us all that. So before I'm gonna combine these images, the first thing I notice in this one is that it's a little bit greenish. It has a little bit of a green tint to it. So I'm gonna take the tint slider and just move that slightly to the magenta side. Not too much though, just a little bit, plus 15, and then I'm gonna slide the temperature a little bit to the cooler side, so that'll get rid a bit of that greenish color. So that's the before, that's the after. Yeah, it's definitely better. Next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into my lens corrections, and I'm just gonna turn on my lens corrections, my profile corrections, chromatic aberration, and the constrain crop. I'm not gonna do any perspective correction on this yet, because I'm gonna do that after my images are combined. So I might just bring that defringe up a little bit, because I think it was in this one, we had a little bit fringing going on. Well, that's not that. Yeah, you can see a little bit here, we have a little bit of a fringe going on. And if I tick that box, it basically gets removed already, so I don't have to do anything to it. I guess that's right for the lens correction. Now, one final thing that I like to do is, before I combine my images, to bring down the highlights just to something like -20-ish, and bring the shadows up with about the same amount. That will do a little bit of a difference. So that's what we're changing to the image right now. Then I'm gonna select all these images, and with the one that I edited selected, I'm gonna press sync. I'm gonna click check all so that everything here is selected, and I'm gonna click synchronize. That's gonna sync the same settings across these 3 images. So now I can give them a color, which makes me understand and remember that I edited these ones. And yellow for me means that I've basically processed them and that they're ready to be converted into an HDR image. So that's what I do inside Lightroom. From here on, I basically go into Nik Software HDRFX Pro. So how to do that? Well, I'm gonna go here and right click, choose export, and down here I can see Google HDRFX Pro 2. So I'm gonna click that, and it's gonna process my 3 photos right here. And after those photos are processed, it will bring up HDRFX Pro. We just have to wait a little bit. I don't have the fastest computer, so bear with me. I guess I could just talk a little bit about the urban exploring thing. Urban exploring is pretty cool to do. It's all about exploring these abandoned buildings, but you gotta be aware that urban exploring can be dangerous. Buildings are not always in the best condition. There might be rotting floors or broken glass lying around everywhere. Then you of course have stuff like asbestos, which could be a dangerous thing. There's all kinds of things to be aware of. But if you are aware of these things, then you know, it's gonna be a cool thing to do. It's a nice hobby, but you know, you shouldn't be scared doing this. It's pretty fun. So we're now getting HDRFX Pro. It's loading the images, and it's gonna give us this graph right here, which basically shows us a preview of these images. Now you have this slider down the bottom, which doesn't necessarily do anything to the image. It just brightens or darkens the preview window. So I can slide it up because it's a little bit dark, and I think this looks quite good already. I mean, You have the alignment here. Now alignment will basically align the images when they're not shot on a tripod. However, I do keep it on always. I never turn it off. Then you have the ghost reduction, which will basically look for parts in the images that are different. So if there's wind, for instance, and you can see these trees, they might be moving between the different exposures, and the ghost reduction will deal with that. Now I don't really think we have anything to deal with. It looks quite good already. Then you have some chromatic aberration. You can, for instance, look down here, see if there is any chromatic aberration down this side. There isn't any, so I don't have to correct it, but if there would be chromatic aberration down here or there, you can correct it with these sliders. So I think this looks good already. I don't have to change anything here, so I'm gonna click create HDR. So now you can see what it's doing. It's just going through all the little things. It's gonna align the exposures, remove the chromatic aberration, remove ghosting, and then it's gonna merge the exposures and prepare the HDR image. So I'm just gonna let that run. It's almost done. And then it will give us the image. So this is the image that HDR Effects Pro comes up with. Now this image doesn't necessarily look that good. I mean, it's still overexposed in the highlights, and I don't really like the yellowish tone of it, but we can work with this. So I can close that down because I'm not going to use any of the presets right here. What I like to do, inside HDR Effects Pro, you're going to have a couple of different tabs. And I like to start basically with the top one and just work my way down. So I'm going to start with tone compression. Now tone compression will basically determine the light in the image. So you can see all the way to the left we get the most natural lighting. This is how you would actually be able to shoot it inside one photo. You would get exposed for this, and you would get completely blown out highlights. That's what you would expect to get. All the way to the right, it's actually going to compress all of that data into the image, as you can see right here. And it does make it look kind of funny, right? So what you would want to find is somewhere in between, where it actually looks good and natural, but still gives you a lot of detail in both the shadows and the highlight areas. So I usually go somewhere between 50 and 100%. Usually somewhere around 60 is good for me. You can still see that these highlights get a little bit grayish and it doesn't really look that good, but we can work with that later on. Now, next slider is the method strength. The method strength is set to 50%, and if I bring that up, we're just gonna get, it's basically gonna define all the detail in the image, but it's also gonna bring up the noise, so you don't want to do too much of it. I'll usually be somewhere around 60, 65, maybe 70%. For the HDR method, now this is where a lot of people go crazy with, but I like to keep this on a realistic and natural touch. So what I do here, you have a couple of different things. You have the depth control, which just controls the amount of shadow areas. It basically defines that shadow. I like to keep it at normal. Same for the detail, I like to keep it at realistic. Some people go to accentuated, but I don't really like that. It gives me a way too grungy look, so I just keep it at realistic. And for the drama, that's usually the one with which I play a little bit. I either have it on natural or on deep, but I like natural a lot more, so I keep it on natural. Now then I like to go into the exposure, and I like to bring my images down because I like dark toned images. I mean, my name is Sinister Suspect, and the locations that I visit usually look really dark and really spooky and stuff like that, so I like to make my images look that way. So the exposure for me usually goes to something like -20%. So that's gonna give me a lot more darkness in this image. Then I like to bring up the shadows a bit, but not too much, just a bit. And now I'm gonna bring up the highlights to get back that light that I lost because of the tone compression. So now I'm actually getting back that light in that room, but we are having a lot of detail now. If I compare that to the original, you can see we're getting much more detail there, so that's good. Same goes for the windows. I might be able to go into the tone compression again and just compress it a bit further, maybe go up to 80%. Which looks quite good. Then the contrast. I like to bring the contrast up a little bit. I guess that looks right. The blacks, just maybe crush the blacks a little. Don't want to do too much, just a bit. And for the whites, you can bring these whites up, but I'm not gonna do it too much, just about, let's say about 30% looks right to me. Then the structure is really cool. As you can see, it really makes the image look very grungy. So you don't want to go all the way, but I would tend to say you can go up quite high, but not everywhere in the image. That's you gotta be aware of what happens. So what I do is I usually find the lowest place where I would set it, let's say about 15 to 20%, and then I can basically define it a little bit more later on. I'm gonna explain that. We gotta go to the next step first, which is the saturation. So I'm just gonna bring down the saturation to -25. I like these desaturated images a lot. I might bring the temperature a little bit to the left to get rid of some more of that yellow tone that we have. I guess that looks right. So now we get into the selective adjustments, and that is where the real power of HDR Effects Pro lies. As you saw with the structure, when I brought it up, it looked good in certain parts of the image. I mean, I can do that again. I like it on the, let's see, I like it down here in this room. That looks really good. And if we bring it down a little bit, I guess I like that on the floor. So I'm just gonna bring this up to 18 again, 19, 18. And now I'm gonna add a control point down there in that room and bring the structure up a lot. So now we're basically adding a lot of structure in that room, which is pretty cool. I can add one down here at the ground, at the floor, and just bring the structure up a little bit there to get some more detail in the ground. And if I hold Alt, I can copy over these control points to different parts of the image. So like that. And I like to zoom out every now and then to look at my image a little bit smaller. I guess that looks alright. I might want to do one on the ceiling as well. Just bring it up a tad. Not too much, just bring it up a little bit. Maybe drop it right here and drop around one right there. So I guess that looks right. We are getting a little bit of noise now, but it's not really a problem, because the images tend to be quite grungy anyway. So we could play around with the contrast right here. which I think looks pretty cool because it darkens that part of the ground. And if I bring up the contrast right here, let's bring the contrast down and let's bring the exposure up a little bit. Just gonna brighten that, basically that streak of light that's falling in. I think this looks right now. So this is it for what I do in HDR Effects Pro. So I now went from this image to that, which looks quite good if you ask me. I'm just gonna bring that tone compression down a little bit, and then bring the highlights down a little bit as well. Yeah, that looks good. So now I'm gonna click save, and that's gonna bring this image back into Lightroom. From there on, I'm basically gonna run it through two more Nik Software effects plugins, and the first one is gonna be my sharpening tool. But before I'm gonna apply the sharpening, I have to actually correct the perspective on this image. There is a slight distortion on this image, and I'm gonna take that out. If we look at this image now, and it's still a little bit yellow down here at this side, but I'm gonna take care of that in a minute. Now if we look at this particular wall, this corner, you can see that it's not really straight, it's slightly at an angle. So if I go into the lens corrections and go into the basic tab, and I'm just gonna hit enable profile corrections, and I'm gonna click this little vertical button down underneath the upright section, and that will try to correct the vertical perspective. Now it hasn't really done a good job. It made it even more at an angle, so I'm just gonna click off, and that means I'm gonna have to do this manually. So if I hover over this vertical, we can see that it's happening to both the corner at the right side of the image, but also at the left side of the image at the door it's also happening. So we can just take that vertical slider and move that into the positive range. So +3 looks about right. +4. We might want to rotate this a little bit, like that. So now it's pretty much straight. And I can click the constraint crop knob, and it looks pretty much straight right now. So that's it for what I would do. I'm now gonna go and color this, let's say, green. So that's because that means that I know that this is an HDR image because it's not yellow. So now I'm gonna do edit in Sharpener Pro, and then I'm gonna choose the raw pre-sharpener. Now normally you would have to apply this before you're gonna combine the images, but because you have to convert your images into TIFF files, I don't like to do that before I do the HDR, because it will leave me with 3 TIFF files, and now it only leaves me with 1. So I don't like all those additional images, so I just do this after I've combined them to HDR. I'm gonna do a copy so that I keep the original HDR image, and now it's gonna open this up into Google or Nik Software Sharpener Pro. So by default it applies an adaptive sharpening of 50%. Now I like to go up to 65. So the image looks quite sharp, and if we click on the image, you can actually see how much sharpening it is applying. So you can really see that this image is becoming much sharper now. It's also bringing up a little bit of the noise, but I don't really mind too much. We can bring up the sharpen edges, so that will only sharpen the edges of the image and not the actual noise. So I quite like that. So I'm gonna click save, and that'll bring this image back into Lightroom again. So we are now back in Lightroom, and I can give this image a 1-star rating, which for me means that this image has been sharpened. So now I'm gonna go and do edit in Color Effects Pro 4. Color Effects Pro 4 is my last tool what I use in my in the editing of my images, and it's in my opinion a really great tool for just shaping the actual colors and the tone of the image. It's now opening it up. Just let that load for a minute. And this is what it will give us. Now, the first thing that I'll have to say, by default it'll fit the image to the size of your screen, but what that's going to mean that the image is going to look slightly blurry. So what you would want is to have increments of 2. So either the exact half of what this image full size is, or a quarter, or an eighth of the size. So what I like to do is just zoom out one time, and now the image will look nice and sharp and crisp in the preview window. So down here I have all my presets, but I'm not going to be working with a preset today. I'm going to show you the process from start to finish by doing it all manually. So if I click the Color Effects Pro 4 tab right there at the top, you can see all these different effects. Now there's a lot of effects in here, but there's a couple of ones that I tend to use a lot. The first one that I like to use is Pro Contrast. So I'm just going to add that, and the first thing you have is you have Correct Color Cast. Now Correct Color Cast will get rid of some of the color probably that is not really something that I like, and that's that green right here. So I can try and correct that like that. I think that looks a bit better, but let's just try it a different way. I'm gonna use the white neutralizer, and that immediately made this look much better. So we can actually click this, so that looks much better. So we're just removing that greenish color on that white. Yeah, that looks much better. So now I'm gonna click Add Filter, and that'll give us a new filter to work with. I like the Pro Contrast. So Pro Contrast, we can correct the color cast if we want, but there's not really that much in it anymore, so we can just keep that at 0. Then we can correct the contrast. I like to boost that up just a little bit, not too much though, just a bit. And then I have my favorite slider, which is the dynamic contrast, which will really do a lot to the image. You don't want to go too much with it though, just bring that up slightly. So you can see it's really brightening the image up again. Then I'm gonna go and see. I like the contrast only as well. Just bring down that contrast only slider, and then bring the soft contrast up all the way, and just bring that opacity down. So I like what that does to the image. It's a little thing I do a lot on my images, just mix that in ever so slightly. Add filter again. Now I'm gonna choose, there's two effects that I really like for this. They're basically right next to each other. You have the low key, which will give us that, which looks pretty cool, and then you have the midnight, which will give us this, which in my opinion looks even cooler. So this is one of the tools that I use a lot to make my images look nice and dark, but there's a little bit of a trick to it. You can see it makes it really dark. What I like to do is bring the opacity down to 50%, so we still get a nice blurry effect and nice darkening effect, but it's not necessarily that pronounced, and we can still see a lot of the original image. And then I'm gonna take the control points, and I'm just gonna take one of these minus control points, and I can just say where I want a little bit more light. So I want a bit more light down here, but not so much. So I'm just gonna do that, make it a little bit smaller, and I can just add in a bit of light there. And just add a bit of light here, maybe add some light down there at the window, maybe a little bit at this ceiling. I can add a bit of light there, and this is really cool. You can see I can sort of like create artificial lighting on these walls, which is pretty cool. So I want to boost that a little bit. I'm going to do the same thing here. Just going to bring that up a little bit. So it's just going to give us some nice depth into this image. Let's add one here. I'm going to try and make this box stand out a bit more. See what that did? It really brings out that box. Just see that difference. And I can add one to the ground as well. So really just brightening, making the ground around that box a little bit brighter. And you can see the difference. We're still darkening the image quite a lot, but not so much that it's gonna look weird. So I can brighten up that ceiling a little bit, which in my opinion looks quite good as well. Do we want to brighten up that? Well, maybe we won't. So that's making the image look quite interesting. And I like to do another filter now. So add filter again, and the next thing I'm gonna do is all about changing the colors of this image. The first thing that I like to do is the brilliance warmth. By default it'll automatically make your image slightly darker, but what I like about this one is you have a saturation slider. I like to bring that down to, let's say, -20. So it's going to give us even less saturation. But then you have the perceptual saturation, and if you bring that up, it's actually gonna, well, it's a weird thing. I don't really know what it does, but it strengthens some colors more than other colors. I guess it's kind of like a cool effect if you use it in combination with the saturation. So just bringing this, you can see what it does. Really changes the way this image looks. I'm just gonna bring that down a little bit. That's nice. So now I'm gonna click add filter, and I'm gonna do, let's do one of the color filters. So by default the color filters are way too too in your face. So I like to bring that opacity down to something really low, so that we can kind of like see if we like any of these. I guess this looks nice with... I like that one. I might bring that up one notch, so that's in front of the other effects, and then I can probably bring the opacity up just a little bit. I think that looks quite good. It's adding in a little bit of yellow to the ceiling again, but the ceiling was getting a little bit blue, so that looks nice. I'm gonna click add filter again, and now I'm gonna add the cross processing, which is a really nice effect in my opinion. You can basically just add these effects. It looks really nice. Oh, I love that one. Even though it makes it look really yellow, it's a beautiful looking one. Just bring that opacity down. Just really looks quite nice in my opinion, but there's one more which I really like. And that's this one. So you can see it's really looking nice now. I really love that sort of like coloring. Next one, add filter. There's usually a couple of things that I still like to do, and the first one is add a vignette. Now I like to use the vignette lens, so I'm just gonna zoom out a little bit so that we can see what we're doing. I like circle vignettes. Maybe bring that size up a little bit. Oh yeah, one effect I also like to add is the darken, lighten, center, and I usually put that in front of the brilliance warmth. What it does, it basically brightens up the center of the image, like so. I like to brighten that up a bit, and then we can darken the outer parts of the image. So it kind of like draws the attention into the center of the image, and then you can just blend that in using the opacity slider. So that looks nice. And finally, at the end, there's always a levels and curves for me to kind of like make the contrast a little bit less. This is a little bit of a special trick that I like to do, and that's just bringing up this one a little bit and bringing down that one just a little bit, and that will reduce the contrast in the image just ever so slightly. Now, sometimes I feel like my image can get a little bit more dark and creepy, and that's when I would actually add the low key. And the low key would, for me, always be positioned in front of the midnight. But there's one thing to be aware of. When you use the low key and midnight both together, they will require quite a lot of processing power of your computer, so it might happen that your computer can't really process it too well. I always bring the opacity down to about 50%, something like that, and then I just go in again using those minus points, and I can just paint the light in again. So I'm gonna do the same as I did with the midnight effect. Just gonna do a little bit less of it this time, just on that wall, maybe a little bit there, on that wall, and just there on the ceiling, and that's about everything that I'll do. So that's the before and after. We can always do a little bit more processing using one of the film effects. Just bring the vignette down all the way, and I'm gonna bring that in front of the vignette. And you can see what's happening. It's really my computer is having a hard time keeping up with this. So I'm gonna bring the grain per pixel up because I don't want to add more grain to it. But now we get these different effects that we can choose from. Something like that looks nice. You know, I like these vintage effects. Something like that. And then just go into the opacity. And you can just bring that opacity up or down to blend it in a little bit. And now you can actually just go in and, let's say, undo the color filters, see what happens. So, I guess that's the final image. I'm pretty happy with how this image turned out. It's not the best image. I mean, I've shot way better images than this, but it's a nice image to show you how the process goes of creating images like this. This is how I would do it. There's a lot of ways how you can do it, but yeah, this is just how I do my processing. If you want to see more of these videos, then subscribe to this channel. I'm going to be doing more photography tutorials, or at least more photography editing tutorials for Lightroom. If you want to see more of my urban exploring, you can go to my website, which is www.sinistersuspect.com. On there you can find a lot of the locations that I visited. You can find photographs that I shot, and if you want to know how I did one of the images or how I edited one of the images, just let me know in one of the comments below, or just post a comment on my website and let me know, and I'll do a tutorial about that image. So that's it for this video. Hope to see you back soon. Peace.